The 1st of January 1943, the northern lights trembled above the frozen spine of Norway as if the sky itself were pulling apart under the weight of a world at war. On that night, far from the better-known fronts and far from the polished strategies displayed in official reports, two men from opposite sides of a brutal conflict were being pushed toward a fate that no intelligence service, no general and no war planner had ever predicted. Their names would not appear in most books or documentaries. Their encounter would not be taught in classrooms. Yet their story would come to represent one of the most improbable human connections forged in the shadows of the Second World War. And on this night, neither of them knew that the cold, biting winds sweeping across Norway's wilderness were not just carrying the distant echoes of gunfire they were carrying destiny. The war at this stage had turned into an unpredictable theater of shifting loyalties, covert movements, and psychological battles waged far beyond the reach of conventional armies. Norway, often overshadowed by the grand narratives of Normandy, Stalingrad, and North Africa, was itself a layered battleground. Beneath its icy mountains, German intelligence units, resistance cells, British commandos, and secret Allied operatives collided in a silent war of sabotage, espionage, and counter-espionage. The British Special Operations Executive, known internally as the SOE, had intensified its pressure on German infrastructure there, while the Luftwaffe scrambled to secure crucial air routes that connected German forces to the Arctic convoys. In this underreported sphere, aircraft passed each other like ghosts, each carrying men who had no idea how fragile the line between life and death had become. High above the Norwegian mountains that evening, American pilot Lieutenant James McAllister guided his B-17 with a precision born out of months of tension. The bomber was returning from a classified reconnaissance mission along the coast, one not listed on official logs, because the Allies had begun monitoring secret German heavy water transfers tied to nuclear research at Vemork. The existence of these flights was known only to a handful of intelligence officers. McAllister did not fully understand the significance of what he was documenting. All he knew was that he was flying into territory where the Luftwaffe patrolled relentlessly. He was in a cold sky where each cloud could hide a predator. At almost the same moment, not far away, Oberleutnant Karl Fischer of the Luftwaffe was climbing into his Messerschmitt Bf 109. Knowing he had been assigned a patrol route that evening with unusually strict communications silence, Fischer had been briefed earlier that afternoon by the Sicherheitsdienst, Germany's intelligence service, that the Allies were increasing attempts to map routes used for high-value transports. Although Fischer was trained as a fighter pilot, he was also occasionally used by the SD due to his ability to stay calm under pressure. Germany's intelligence arms often leaned on certain pilots to double as airborne sentinels, scanning patterns of Allied reconnaissance missions. These covert tasks meant little to most Luftwaffe pilots, but Fischer sensed what he was involved in, a hidden war waged through shadows and whispers rather than bullets. The wind battered McAllister's bomber as it drifted slightly off its intended route. An unexpected storm front rolled in from the north, swallowing the sky and forcing him to adjust altitude. Fischer, miles away, intercepted Allied radio static, almost certainly the bomber he was expected to locate. His commanders believed Allied reconnaissance teams were closing in on secrets not yet ready for the world to discover, secrets involving heavy water, atomic research, and Hitler's increasingly desperate attempts to shift the war's trajectory. Fischer followed his instincts and banked his aircraft toward the disturbance. When the two aircraft finally crossed paths, the encounter was almost predatory in its suddenness. McAllister barely had time to signal his crew before tracer rounds sliced through the air, cutting arcs of fire across the darkness. The storm turned the engagement into chaos. The bomber's gunners, half blind in the snow, returned fire, and Fischer found himself dodging blindly as flak and ice danced together. The B-17 shuddered under impact, its engines screaming. Fischer felt the familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with something he rarely allowed himself to feel: uncertainty. It happened in seconds. One final burst from McAllister's desperate tail gunner struck Fischer's aircraft, shredding part of the wing, Fisher reacted with extraordinary control, but the damage was fatal. At the same time, shells from the Bf-109 had torn through the bomber's fuselage. Both machines were dying, spiraling toward a world frozen and indifferent. The crash sites were separated by less than half a mile, but in those mountains, that distance might as well have been 10. McAllister stumbled from the wreckage, his breath crystallizing instantly. His crew was scattered. Some had perished on impact, others were missing. He had no sense of direction, no idea where German patrols might be hiding, no notion of how close danger truly was. But he knew he had to move. Fisher's crash was more controlled, but he found himself trapped inside the cockpit. Flames licked at the edges of the wreck. When he finally managed to force the canopy open, he collapsed into the snow, blood freezing on his face. He dragged himself toward a cluster of trees, each step an exercise in willpower. The storm grew worse, but something deeper than survival drove him onward. Desire to understand the strange feeling that had passed through him when he saw the bomber falling simultaneously beside him. Even then, unable to stand straight, he felt the first crack in the hardened shell of duty. Hours later, McAllister spotted a trail in the snow footprints, uneven, as if made by someone injured. He followed them not because he wanted to, but because something instinctive pushed him forward. When he finally found Fisher slumped against a tree, barely conscious, the world seemed to hold its breath. Here were two men, raised on propaganda, trained to kill each other, abandoned by the very machines that had carried them. McAllister approached carefully, unsure whether Fisher would reach for a weapon. Instead, Fisher simply stared back, eyes clouded with pain, no hatred. No commands, just a human being caught in the same merciless storm. Without speaking, McAllister extended his hand. Fisher hesitated, not because McAllister was the enemy, but because he could not believe such a thing was possible. Yet something inside him, something beyond the war, beyond orders, made him take the American's hand. And so, with no witnesses, no military oversight, and no propaganda machines watching, two enemy pilots leaned on each other and began the slow descent into the valley below. The snow deepened with every step. Both men were trembling from the cold, their breaths short and ragged. They soon realized they had no chance of finding shelter unless they worked together. The mountains were littered with patrols, German, Norwegian resistance, and even British SO teams operating deep undercover. Both men carried secrets far too sensitive to fall into the wrong hands. And yet, each knew that turning away would mean certain death. As they traveled, neither spoke of war. Neither spoke of missions or loyalty. The silence between them became a bridge. Without knowing it, they were stepping into one of the least known psychological battlegrounds of WWII, the front, where identity, propaganda, and morality unraveled. What they didn't know was that as they struggled through the snow, German intelligence units had already detected irregular radio transmissions from a local outpost. The crash had triggered alarms. An SD field group nearby suspected that Allied operatives might attempt to rescue the bomber crew to retrieve reconnaissance materials. Meanwhile, the Norwegian resistance had intercepted German chatter, believing a high-value Luftwaffe officer might have survived. The mountain was quickly becoming a silent vortex of pursuit. Three forces, each unaware that the targets they sought were walking together. Night fell with brutal finality. McAllister and Fisher found a half-collapsed shepherd's hut buried under snow. Inside, shielded from the worst of the wind, they finally spoke. Not about politics, not about ideology. They spoke of exhaustion, of families they hadn't seen, of how the war had changed the texture of their dreams. As Fisher's wounds worsened, McAllister removed torn pieces of his own uniform to bandage him. That night, Fisher confessed something he had never told another soul. He did not believe Germany's war could be won, and he no longer believed in what his superiors claimed. McAllister responded not with triumph, but with quiet understanding. He, too, had begun to see the war as something orchestrated by unseen hands intelligence agencies, power brokers and political players shaping battles civilians never knew existed. By morning, they resumed their journey. But now something had shifted. They were no longer two soldiers trapped by circumstance. They were men unraveling the hidden architecture of a war far darker than the public realized, unknown to them. A British SO team operating nearby Task Force Harrier had been monitoring unusual German troop movements. The British feared the SD was escorting heavy water shipments, and any unusual German presence triggered immediate alerts. When Harrier operatives discovered signs of a downed aircraft, they assumed it belonged to the Germans and prepared an ambush. The trap they laid would bring another unseen force into the pilot's path. As Fisher and McAllister approached a ravine, gunfire erupted. The world turned violent again in a storm of bullets and snow. The SO operatives, hidden among icy rocks, expected a German officer, not two men struggling side by side. Fisher pushed McAllister aside, taking the brunt of the first shot in his shoulder. McAllister dragged him behind a ridge and shouted in English, a desperate cry to cease fire. The ambush team, stunned by what they saw a Luftwaffe pilot protecting. An American hesitated long enough to lower their weapons. That moment, brief and fragile, marked the beginning of one of the strangest rescue operations of the war. The SO team realized both men carried information of immense value. The American had reconnaissance details connected to the German nuclear program, and the German had insights into SD movements. The British faced an impossible choice: treat Fisher as a prisoner of war or as an unwanted liability. But the leader of the team, a man named Arthur Bramble, made a decision based purely on witnessing something he did not believe humans were still capable of under wartime conditions: compassion. The SO extracted both men and hid them in a remote cabin used for safehouse transfers. For the next 2 days, as Norwegian resistance couriers helped prepare an exfiltration route, the two pilots were moved through the underground network that had carried countless secrets, agents, and escapees. They passed through tunnels where early attempts at psychological warfare had been coordinated secret programs to drop forged German documents, spread disinformation, and scramble radio codes. They glimpsed the invisible machinery of a world where battles were fought not with guns but with whispers, forged maps, and intercepted orders. At the final safe house before extraction, McAllister and Fisher were separated. The Allies could not allow a German officer to leave Norway with them, even if he had walked beside an American. Fisher understood this before anyone explained it. McAllister tried to argue, but Fisher stopped him. If he had survived the crash only to eventually be captured, he could accept that fate. But he could not deny the truth he had discovered in the mountains, that an enemy had saved him. As they were escorted away in different directions, Fisher turned once more, raising a trembling hand in farewell. McAllister raised his in return. No words passed between them, because no words were needed. Fisher was eventually taken by German forces weeks later, and because he refused to offer details about his disappearance, he was quietly reassigned. McAllister returned to Britain with intelligence that contributed to mapping German research routes. Both men continued the war, each carrying a memory they couldn't explain to anyone else. For decades, their lives moved on in silence. Fisher became a quiet engineer in post-war Germany. McAllister returned to the United States and worked as a commercial pilot. The world forgot what had happened, but neither man forgot. In 1980, 37 years after their paths crossed, a Norwegian historian researching untold wartime survival stories found incomplete SO files referencing two pilots, enemy and ally, rescued together. After tracking down fragments of testimonies, he identified McAllister. When McAllister confirmed the story, the historian sought Fisher, eventually locating him through wartime archives. When the two men met again on a cold morning in Norway, the same mountains where they had stumbled half dead now stood calm and silent. They walked toward each other, older, slower, but carrying the same understanding they had once shared in a snowstorm. And when Fisher finally embraced McAllister, he whispered something only the two of them would ever understand. We survived the war the moment we stopped fighting it. Their reunion was quiet. No cameras, no parades. Just two men standing in the shadow of their past, bound forever by a truth the world rarely sees, that beneath even the darkest chapters of history, humanity can still flicker like a match in the wind, their story never became famous. It did not reshape global politics or appear in most books. But for those who know it, it reveals something hidden in the cracks of World War II. Something rarely spoken but always present. The war was not just fought by nations or strategies. It was fought inside the minds and souls of ordinary people forced into extraordinary darkness. And sometimes in the most unlikely places, that darkness was pierced not by victory or ideology, but by a simple act of human compassion between two men who were supposed to hate each other.